This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Salmond.
Good morning and welcome to Scotland Speaks with Salmond on a lovely sunny day in sunny Glasgow as we continue our series looking what Scotland might have looked like if we had voted yes in 2014 as we celebrate 10 years since the independence referendum. Now here I am just next to the BBC and just along from STV, apt indeed, as today Alex turns his interviewing skills to interviewing the broadcaster extraordinaire Bernard Ponsonby. Over to Alex and Bernard.
So Bernard Ponsonby, we're in a world now where Scotland voted yes in September the 18th, 2014, where the negotiations with the UK were successfully completed by the end of 2015, and the parties are preparing for the first election for an independent Scottish Parliament. What would have happened to Scotland's parties in that context?
Well, I think the first thing that you would have to do as First Minister is to bring people together. Is the new state going to be a big tent state where everybody is going to have their say? Because when you have a constitutional referendum, it invites an emotional response, and there is always a degree of anger which follows such referenda. So there'll be a lot of people who are on the losing side who are going to feel very, very hurt, who need to be persuaded that they can take ownership of this project just as much of the people who have voted yes. For the parties, I suspect that the SNP would be trusted to run the independent parliament, certainly in the early years, because political parties, at the end of the day, most of them and most of the politicians accept the judgment of the people. That would buy you a certain degree of political currency. Longer term, of course, there would be the issue of whether or not independence would be the catalyst for any kind of political realignment.
Let's assume, as a well-known consensus politician, I invited the other parties into the negotiations, because that would have been the sensible thing to do, so that it was Team Scotland instead of Team Salmond. Would that be the move they would have accepted, or do you think there would have been last-ditchers and holdouts?
No, I think that everybody would have accepted it. I mean, politics is a bruising business, but once the people speak, I think all politicians, irrespective of their party, make peace with the judgment of the people. So I think in terms of moving the debate on and having a big tent approach, funnily enough, there wouldn't have been much of a problem at the level of the politicians. I think where you would have had some work to do is within the country with people who simply did not wish to accept this, because everybody knows that the emotions on both sides were extremely raw, and how you, as the First Minister in a Scotland moving towards independence, dealt with those who did not feel part of this project would have been a big, big issue. But I suspect you wouldn't have had a problem with political opponents, because at the end of the day, most politicians, most of the time, accept the judgment of the people.
And then running into the first elections for an independent Scotland, let's assume they'd have been in May 2016, would the Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrats, would they have wanted to split from the government when they'd been effectively part of for the negotiations so as they could run independently, or would they have tried to stay within the tent for these first elections?
The answer is that they would stay within the tent for the first election. I think the longer term issue is, would independence usher in a process of realignment in politics, and if there was to be a realignment in politics, where would that realignment come? Well, first of all, let's deal with the SNP. Had Scotland become independent in 1979, had the 1st of March 1979 not have been about a Scottish Assembly, but been about independence, and had the vote been yes, the SNP would have fallen apart post-independence, and it would have fallen apart because everyone in the SNP in those days used to say, we're a radical party that puts the Scottish interest first. Now, that actually doesn't mean anything in practical ideological terms. But for the last 25 years, the SNP has had ideological anchors which are broadly social democratic. Let's not get into how social democratic they are, but they are a broadly social democratic party. The Labour Party, and let's not get into how social democratic they are broadly a social democratic party. So I don't think that the SNP would fall apart. I keep reading in my newspapers that certain people within the SNP are really Tories who would go off to the Tory party in an independent Scotland, and people like Fergus Ewan and Kate Forbes are always mentioned in this regard. Utter rubbish. I think they are mainstream social democratic individuals. There might be an issue of how would Labour play things in the longer term? The second thing is that I think the Tories would be properly conservative in an independent Scotland, because in a certain sense, philosophically, they have been wrong-footed by devolution, and in terms of their opposition during the devolved years, in some respects, you know, they've just been part of the consensus. They haven't offered anything which is distinctly centre-right.
Under Fraser, would his time come in that scenario of the Conservative Party in an independent Scotland? Then surely his argument for some sort of free Scottish Conservative Party would be accepted, wouldn't it?
Well, first of all, they would be independent, yes, because there wouldn't be the Conservative and Unionist Party in a UK context. But I think that it would also impose upon them the discipline of actually saying, what does a centre-right Scotland actually look like? At the moment, I think, in a strange kind of a way, they are hampered with the confines of the constitutional settlement, and very often, sometimes, even when they're leading in the Parliament, they lead not from the political right, they lead from the political left, and have signed up to things over the years which I think are curious coming from Conservatives. I think where there would be a definitive realignment would be if one looks at the broad Yes movement in 2014, there were people within that broad consensus that you could call a radical left. They are people who are really not social democrats. They're Clause 4 socialists. They basically believe in an independent Scottish republic. They believe in nationalising the commanding heights of the economy, the means of production, distribution and exchange. Now, whatever else First Minister Salmond in an independent Scotland is, he ain't no Marxist. He is a very straight down the middle social democrat in the mould of European social democratic parties. And I suspect that First Minister Salmond would come under attack pretty quickly from those whose goal is for an independent socialist republic. And therefore I think there would be some sort of coalescing around a genuinely hard left alternative, and I don't mean that in any pejorative sense.
What would I have found most difficult to handle in that? Would it have been the hard left element or the Republican element, which might have appealed to quite a grouping in the SNP?
Well, I think that they're two separate things, because you can actually be a Conservative and a Republican, you can be a Liberal Democrat and a Republican. I mean, people as diverse as Rosanna Cunningham to George Fawkes are members of Republic. I think that in terms of republicanism, where we now are, and I suspect in an independent Scotland you would have hardcore monarchists and hardcore Republicans. I suspect the hardcore monarchists outnumber the hardcore Republicans, and then you've got the biggest slice of the electorate, which is I couldn't care less about the institution. But when you have a new constitutional settlement, it's incumbent on leaders to ask, what kind of country do we wish to be? And at some point, of course, during the process of having a written constitution, you have to ask yourself the question, in an independent nation, do we wish to be citizens or do we wish to be subjects? Now, if the answer to that question is that you wish to be a citizen rather than a subject, it appears to me that any other arguments for monarchy fall on that basis alone. And I suspect, perhaps not initially, but further on down the line, as a new state gathers in confidence and defines what it means, not only nationally but internationally, I think that big group in the middle, which is I couldn't care less about monarchy, would disproportionately break on the Republican side if there was to be a referendum on the monarchy.
I think my inclination, trying to think it through, would have been that to open the question, but not yet. It would have been a St. Augustine approach to this, and perhaps, certainly, it would have been, in my view, rather foolish for an independent country to countenance deposing Elizabeth, Queen of Scots, the late Queen.
But you can tell me I'm wrong about this. I have always thought, and tell me I'm wrong, I have always thought that you were a gut Republican, but for essentially strategic reasons did not think that the thing was worth opening up. Certainly not in the 2014 referendum, because if it was to be opened up, it would lead the campaign up a side track. And of course, we're here in the west of Scotland. When you talk all things monarchy, you then start to get into some murky waters about green and orange, and you don't want the debate to go there. But it's always struck me that you've been a gut Republican.
And the timing would be the key issue. And who knows, maybe...
I notice you never answered that question.
Well, look, that's because I wasn't demurring from your assessment. But the timing of when you'd want the new state, the new country, to be settled before you re-entered another, because you'd have had three big constitutional arguments. First one on independence, probably settled, I think, would have been generally accepted. The second one, of course, would be Europe, because if Scotland's independent and the rest of the UK is out, then there'd be another constitutional negotiations. And I think my view would be that the Republic would be certainly the third thing you'd want to look at, and in due course. And who knows, maybe I would be planning my retirement as First Minister, but allowing the referendum to go ahead after I go.
Given your proclivities for sticking around, you would be running for the role of President in an independent Scotland.
Well, of course, now that...
If Michael Higgins can do it at what age? He's getting on a bit.
Exceptional poet. Of course, there is a vacancy given the death of the late Sean Connolly. I mean, that's who knows. But certainly, my inclination would be it would be at least 10 years, maybe more. And I think most people, if they thought it was coming and that question would be addressed, would probably have settled down to that. We haven't really got to the guts for it. I mean, the SNP continue a bit of fraying at the edges. The Scottish Conservative Party, a fairly fundamental reassessment. The Labour Party. Now, this is the question. Does Labour stay within that social democratic nexus, or does it move left to stop a left-wing challenge to its political base, or what there is?
I honestly don't know. I couldn't read that. I suspect that there are some people, for tribal reasons, and in politics, tribal instincts work a lot. There might be some people within the Labour Party on the Labour left, people that would have been dyed-in-the-wool supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, who would peel off to what I think definitely would emerge, which is a sort of genuinely socialist alternative on the left. What, if you like, the Social Democrats do within the Labour Party, I know not. The key question, of course, is whether or not there's any room on the political spectrum for them, whether or not they have any electoral traction. But it was Mrs. Thatcher who once said after the 1983 election, when people said, this is the death of Labour, and she quite rightly said, the Labour Party will be a long time a-dying. What is interesting, I don't think this would happen, but it's genuinely interesting to raise the question. There are many people who support Scottish independence, who will vote SNP in order to try and deliver Scottish independence, but they'll say, I'm really Labour. And of course, when you were First Minister, it was made possible because people peeled off from Labour, and the SNP had transformed itself ideologically, that it made it acceptable for Labour people who in their political emotional psyche regard themselves as voting in the Labour interest. They voted SNP in order to get an endgame. Would any of them go back? I suspect not, because I think the SNP will have been around too long. That, as I always put it, the issue for Labour is not that it's dying, but that the granddaughters of Fife miners and the grandsons of steelworkers in Lanarkshire have now got into the habit of voting for a social democratic party, which is also a nationalist party.
And we haven't dealt with the Green Party, and perhaps broader than that, the politics of self-identification and that range of current political thinking. How would it have got on in that independent Scotland?
I suspect you, like me, can become a little confused about politics these days. The last century, in a sense, was the politics of the struggle between labour and capital. That was really the struggle of 20th century politics. And in a sense, in the Scottish context, the overwhelming focus on class started to recalibrate around the politics of national identity and nationalism and how you're governed and decentralisation of government and the Home Rule movement and all of that. So we then, in the Scottish context, had a bit of class politics with the politics of national identity. But of course, many young people now don't identify at all with the questions of class. They will be cognizant of the questions of national identity, but the issue of the planet and the issue of what is now referred to as culture wars are a big thing. So I think that in an independent Scotland, the old certainties that come from the anchors of class and national identity, well, they're in competition with a whole load of new things, which means that there's probably scope for the Greens and for other parties to make their mark.
And this wouldn't be unusual. I mean, in a European liberal democracy, with a proportional voting system, which they all basically have, it wouldn't be unusual to have 6, 7, 8 parties with parliamentary representation and regular coalitions among the whole bunch of them. So if Scotland had more parties, we're becoming more normal as opposed to the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah, and but you still have to, of course, command a majority in Parliament, which means putting together coalitions. In an independent Scotland, the most obvious coalition is SNP and Labour, no question. And
would that be your forecast for well, let's say we were moving into the 2026 election, or would that have already happened? Do you think that would have happened already? Do you think
it's impossible to be definitive about the arithmetic.
Remember, the party which carries a country to independence gets a certain leeway.
Yeah.
And unless they make a total muck of things like, well, I don't know, going in for identity politics, not building ferries, bottle schemes and all that nonsense, unless they do something like that, they really have to try the patience of an electorate not to have a fair passage of time before they're not the dominant party.
In the first elections to any independent parliament, I suspect the view of people within the Labour Party is that they've won the referendum. Salmond has the right to make a fist of this. It's not up to us to help out or to be overly critical. We'll try and be as constructive as possible. But longer term, because all governments run into difficulties, and I know that you've been also interrogating what the economic challenges are. Not only do I think that your biggest challenge would be uniting the country, the management of expectations in the early years would be very, very key, because any yes vote will have been turbocharged by people, particularly people in this city, who feel that politics has left them behind, where there are intergenerational poverty, which scars actually a lot of folk in this city. And when the whole of the central belt of Scotland, you have far too many people who are economically inactive, and they're looking for constitutional change as a means to a better life.
Which is what Dr. Jim Walker was pointing to in last week's episode, almost a contrast between a surge of prosperity with an independent Scotland looking with single market access like a good prospect for many incoming companies and incoming people, but also this residual depth of poverty that we have in Scotland, and the aspirations of these people for a better life in this new independent state.
Well, whatever the situation is, the economic challenges would be significant. And I suspect actually for many years after your scenario of Scotland being independent, people wouldn't actually notice terribly much change, because affecting fundamental change to lives takes time. And the issue that I think that you would have is that people, particularly those in desperate circumstances, want their lives changed quickly, and change in politics doesn't come quickly, and therefore the management of expectations, I think, would be a big thing for you.
Just thinking about that for a last point, I mean, in the last 10 years, for most people and for most families, it's been a pretty depressing time. And if you compare it with the hope and expectation of 2014 among a substantial section of the population, that absence of hope is a factor, certainly a factor I feel. I don't know, what would your commentary be on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, the difficulty sort of looking ahead is that there is no doubt that 2008 has acted as a brake. There is no doubt the pandemic has acted as a brake. But even out with this, the levels of economic growth across a lot of economies in Europe have been pretty poor. And the big issue, I think, if you are a left of centre politician in Scotland, is that the post-war consensus, which delivered enormous benefits for working people, the National Health Service, a social floor below which no citizen would actually fall, enormous benefits. In an era of low economic growth, globalisation, sustaining the benefits of the social democratic era is extremely difficult, and the big challenge going forward is how you sustain our public services, how you lift people out of poverty, how you give people hope, how you define a new country in terms of the ability to carry itself within the world and make people proud of the community that they are a part of. These are difficult issues, and one of the problems is that tons of intellectual energy has gone into the question of how do you get independence, and very little energy into what you actually do if you were to get independence.
Of course, you point to yourself, these are big challenges, and these are things that people rise to, as opposed to trying to work out what type of gender appears in a female prison, or some of the other questions that have preoccupied the Scottish Parliament in recent times. If there's big challenges, isn't that the thing that gets the effort? It certainly keeps people's attention on the job in hand, as opposed to wandering off into other subjects.
So big issues require big politicians with well worked out plans, and it would also require big politicians to have a serious, grown up, mature, direct, difficult conversation with the country. I don't even think there's been any politician of the devolved era that's, in a sense, taken on the country and been absolutely honest about the nature of the challenges that we're faced with. I mean, I actually worry about the future. I'm very, very pessimistic about the future. And the reason I'm pessimistic about the future is that the longevity in terms of people living longer is having fundamental challenges for our health service and all of our other public services going forward. And every politician still plays the game of acting out of self-interest, consistent of getting them through the electoral cycle, rather than acting in that utterly abused phrase in politics in the national interest.
And for yourself, would you have had a lot of fun over the last 10 years commenting on the twists and turns of the politics of an independent Scotland?
I've enjoyed it, and I've never said which side of this constitutional debate I'm on. I like analysing politics. I like listening to politicians of all different political colours. I think what we need to cut through a lot of the angry noise and misinformation of social media is space where you have time to listen to what people think. And my plea always, and I always say this to friends of mine who say they're all the same, I said they're not all the same. They're not all the same. The majority of them go into this for entirely good reasons. They're motivated for good reasons. And if you don't like what they're saying, get off your arse and stand yourself.
Bernard Ponsonby, political analyst extraordinaire. Thank you so much for talking about the politics of an independent Scotland.
Pleasure, Alec.
As we continue outside the Glasgow Science Centre, it is apt indeed, because in the IMAX cinema just inside the Glasgow Science Centre, in a couple of weeks' time on the 14th of September, we'll be hearing from Alex and Bernard Ponsonby and a host of other people who are involved in the Yes campaign of 2014. Here's a reminder of some of the people who are participating. And now over to Alex and Bernard for a short, sweet and funny promo.
So Bernard Ponsonby, you and I, a couple of weeks' time together in the Science Centre here. I'm not sure if you're interviewing me or I'm interviewing you, but there's a cast, well, not a cast of thousands, but certainly a cast of dozens on recollections of Scotland's referendum 10 years ago. How will it go?
I have absolutely no idea, because I don't know what I'm doing, but I should. There's a bit of trepidation here, because I'm not so sure if I'm interviewing people or being interviewed. I've spent 34 years interviewing folk like yourself, not being interviewed.
Time for a change.
Time for a change. There's a slogan.
Now last week in our series, well, we started our series indeed on what an independent Scotland might have looked like by interviewing world-renowned economist Dr. Jim Walker. Here's some snippets from that interview with Dr. Jim Walker and Alex Salmond.
Wider afield, I mean, one of the relatively few things I agree with David Cameron about was fostering a strong economic relationship with China. Since Cameron's time, that relationship has gone into, if not the deep freeze, then certainly into the chiller.
Yeah.
An independent Scotland would have been able to pursue a more economically cooperative policy. Would there have been big advantage there in terms of investment patterns and trade flow?
I think it almost goes without saying, although it seems to be, it needs to be said more and more often these days, that you're much better dealing with the fastest growing economies in the world than you are in dealing with the slowest growing economies in the world, because that's where the market is expanding. I mean, if you look back at the period after the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the country that saved the whole global economy was China, because it was growing so much faster in terms of its import demand than places like America, Europe and elsewhere. And that hasn't stopped. I mean, it's gone through a wee bit of a struggling point at the moment. But for most of the last 10 years, China has been the biggest engine of economic growth in the global economy. Now it's kind of handing it over to India. So maybe some of our ties with India, with the subcontinent and with China would have been a fantastic deal for Scottish business.
And here's what you had to say about last week's show. The original Dave says, for sure, it might have been difficult for the first few years, but with a competent government, we would have been a damn sight more better off than we are at this moment in time. Pauline says, excellent show. Fair gies me hurt. Brings comfort and hope when you know that there are serious players still working hard and intelligently for Scotland to regain its independence. Thank you. Glasgow grad says, and there is the first mistake at 3 minutes in. You cannot assume that if Scotland votes for independence, that the Brexit vote would have gone ahead. Had we voted for our independence, Cameron would have resigned and Labour would have won the general election. There would have been much rearranging of the furniture, but that Brexit vote would not have been called. Louise Hogg says, good show. Now we need to carefully pick ourselves up and try again. And finally, Indie Boy says, that was a fascinating interview with Jim Walker, and he gave great insight on how Scotland would have overcome obstacles and grown its economy had it been an independent country in the last 10 years. We need independence more than ever, and I hope it's sooner rather than later. Thank you very much indeed for your tweets, messages and emails. Please do keep them coming in. We love to hear from them. Now over to Alex, who's going to give his thoughts on his interview with Bernard and what an independent Scotland might have looked like. Over to Alex.
To examine the what if of the politics of independent Scotland, there's no better commentator than Bernard Ponsonby, as he has shown today. It would have been an interesting passage. Firstly, the negotiations for independence, then if Brexit happened to the rest of the UK, how would Scotland have fared? Well, at least we'd have had another 500 million people behind us in that negotiation. And then how would the party interchange have worked out? Would we have a republic? Would we have a monarchy? Would there be more parties? Would there be less? Bernard has steered us very wisely. I think the underlying question is this, though. Would we manage to lift the vision of Scotland and the circumstances of Scots in the context of independence in a way certainly that hasn't proved possible and devolved Scotland over the last 10 years? For most folk in the country, the last 10 years has been pretty difficult. Not just austerity, but also the absence of hope, even more sometimes than the absence of financial resources. It's been a difficult, depressing period. I like to think that the challenges of an independent Scotland, although they would be substantial, would be ones that would be overcome by people anxious to put their shoulder to the wheel and make a success of the new independent state. Certainly there would have been a lot of argument and a lot of people and a lot of companies would have wanted to come into that Scotland. The challenge, I think, would be to make sure that the lives of ordinary Scots would be similarly enhanced by that process. Some of the issues which are being debated in the Republic of Ireland at the present moment, where the burgeoning wealth of the nation is reflected in the wealth of Irish people, that would be the challenge for Scotland. I hope that the Scottish politicians who were there would have applied themselves to that central argument of establishing the democratic politics of an independent state and bettering the lives of the people, rising to the challenge of an independent Scotland.
And with that, we come to the end of this week's show, a special Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond, as we look back over a series of programmes of what an independent Scotland might have looked like if we voted yes in 2014. Now, I'm still outside the amazing Glasgow Science Centre, and in a couple of weeks' time, on the 14th of September, remember you can get your tickets as we discuss and discover views of people of what happened in 2014 and where we go from now. And you'll be able to hear from Alex Salmond, Bernard Ponsonby, the chair of Yes Scotland, Dennis Canavan, Michelle Thompson, Philippa Whitford, Joanna Cherry, Fergus Ewing, Alex Neil, and a whole host of other people. And of course, from the Reverend Stuart Campbell in the flesh, Wings Over Scotland, and the author of the Wee Blue Book, which was so pivotal to the vote in 2014. So from all of us here at the Glasgow Science Centre, we hope to see you all next week, same time, but different place on Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond. But until then, from all of us, take care. Bye-bye for now.
This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.